Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, explorers, depending on where you're joining us from today. Welcome to Reach the World's Explorer program. For 25 years, Reach the World has inspired youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens, all through virtual exchange. My name is Tim, and if you followed Reach the World's live virtual exchange with Endurance22, or the Endurance22 Expedition, the full name, or if you're reliving the excitement of that experience on demand with your class, you will certainly recognize today's very special live stream guest. We'll be talking shortly with Expedition Leader Dr. John Shears, who's joining us from England to discuss the Antarctic Treaty and the plan to protect Shackleton's endurance through a conservation management plan. We'll find out a lot more about both of those topics. And today's event is generously supported by the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust, which organized and funded the Endurance22 expedition. Before we bring Dr. Shears onto the stage, a very warm welcome to the teachers and students who are joining us live today. If you're tuning in via YouTube, we would love for you to use the chat bar and let us know where you're joining us from, even just that you're here, and to share any questions you have for Dr. Shears as we go. We'll cover as much ground and answer as many questions as we can in the next 45 minutes or so. Okay, let's get into it. I am very pleased to welcome once again to Reach the World, Endurance22 Expedition Leader, Dr. John Shears. Hello, Dr. Shears.
Hello, everyone. Great to be back. Looking forward to the live stream today, Tim.
It is wonderful to see you again. We were chatting before we went live that you have to be one of our most famous, frequent participants in Reach the World live streams. It's fabulous to have you back and to learn more from you. Every time we chat, we learn a lot from you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tim.
Fantastic. Well, we have a limited amount of time as usual today, and we have a lot to cover. So I'm going to dive right into it. You have some pictures and some stories you want to tell us today. And let's get started. We've got some big topics to cover.
Yes, that's right, Tim. So, yeah, I'm going to talk, hopefully for about 20 minutes or so about the Antarctic Treaty and how under the Antarctic Treaty, Shackleton's endurance is protected through this conservation management plan, which is going to be shown for the first time in the next few weeks. So, so I'm going to answer a few questions as we go through today. What actually happens in Antarctica now and in the past? How is it protected through this incredible international agreement called the Antarctic Treaty? But how do these nations which have signed the treaty know what's going on there? So we'll talk a little bit about how you can inspect bases and stations in Antarctica. And I've been a treaty inspector, so I can tell you a little bit about that from real life. Then I'll talk a little bit about how endurance is protected under the treaty. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's the future for this agreement and this treaty as we go into the next decade or so. Okay.
Fantastic.
So first of all, I just wanted to make it clear to everyone who's listening in that not that many people go to Antarctica. It still remains the world's largest wilderness area in the world. And if you look at these little maps at the bottom of the slide there, as you're looking at it on the left, you can see on land and all those green areas. This is using satellite remote sensing and maps. Any of the green areas are where there isn't very much human impact. Anything that's red and orange, like North America, United States, Europe, China, India, you can see where all the major development has taken place. But if you look at the bottom of the map, Antarctica, it's all green. So very, very little human impact on land. And it's the same at sea. In the other diagram on the right, you can see where there's been pollution in the world's oceans. And still around Antarctica, you see the blue areas around Antarctica. Antarctica remains remarkably unpolluted. But I'll talk about it a bit later because, unfortunately, because of our global impact across the planet, even really remote areas like where I've been to search for endurance, the Weddell Sea, you can still find evidence of man's pollution, not from the ships we're using, but coming through ocean currents and through air currents and being deposited on Antarctica. So what sort of things happen in Antarctica? Well, in the past, we've had, as all of you listening know, Endurance, Shackleton in the early 1900s, Captain Scott as well, a big era for exploration at at that time. But there was also industrial activities happening. There was sealing and there was also whaling. So millions of seals and whales were collected for their blubber, for their oil, for their meat, and almost leading to the extinction of some species. Then you had a big international science program, the International Geophysical Year in 1957, and that really sort of set the template for what would happen to Antarctica in the future. And today, science is the main activity that you find in Antarctica. But there are other things that happen there, as well as the science. There's fishing, particularly for fin fish, for krill, for squid. And in the last 20 years, tourism and private adventure expeditions have really taken off. Something like 100,000 tourists now visit Antarctica every year. So in the sort of early days, back in big area of development in Antarctica started in the Second World War. So you had the early expeditions of Scott, Shackleton, Amundsen, but then the Second World War and countries such as the UK built bases in Antarctica. This is the first British official base, which is called Base A. It's on Port Lockroy on the Antarctic Peninsula. Beautiful little site. I've been there several times, and it's just like, as you can see, wonderful mountain ranges around you. But it was actually built as a military base, not for science. They were trying to protect the UK's interests in Antarctica. They were worried about German raiders. Argentina had actually set up a territorial claim. So in those days, it was all about trying to get political influence for these bases and making sure that there was, sovereign interests were protected and that the military basically took command. Then you had the International Geophysical Year. So this is when scientists first started to think about, well, what's Antarctica like? No one had really done any work in Antarctica since the early 1900s and Captain Scott. So there was a big international program, International Geophysical Year. And it was a huge, huge success. They had 12 nations working there, including South Africa. For those of you who know, we used their ship, the Weddell Sea, for the Endurance22. So they were one of the first nations to work in Antarctica, along with the UK, America, Russia, were all part of these original 12 nations. And they established 55 scientific nations across the continent. And this is when South Pole Station was built by the US, McMurdo Station. We had the Halley Station built in the UK. And very, very important new scientific knowledge was gained from the IGY, and particularly doing traverses across the Antarctic ice cap, and they were using radar, and that showed that the ice cap in places is over 3 miles deep, and no one knew before then quite how deep and extensive the Antarctic ice sheet was.
There are 2 points I want to touch on for that, because I think they bear just a little bit more description. First of all, these vehicles are really cool. I don't feel like you see vehicles like this anywhere else on Earth.
Yeah. So these are sort of early versions of snowcats, but this type of tracked vehicle is still used today. So British Antarctic Survey still use these sort of vehicles, as does the US now, National Science Foundation, and people still do traverses with radar to check the depth of the ice sheets and see what's happening now because of climate change. So these sorts of vehicles remain extremely important for doing scientific work in Antarctica.
All right, and you made a brief reference to some of the new data coming out of the International Geophysical Year, found that the ice shelf is 3 miles thick. 3 miles thick in places.
It's incredible. And they also started in the International Geophysical Year doing a lot of work looking at the atmosphere. And this is when ozone first started to be measured. And it's because of these long records from the early 1950s through the British Antarctic Survey in the early 1980s was actually able to show the hole in the ozone layer, which was caused by things such as chlorofluorocarbons from aerosols, from refrigerants, and that led to the Montreal Protocol, which banned these substances. And the ozone hole is now gradually recovering and filling in. So the International Geophysical Year was a big success. But a number of people around the world, particularly the scientists, were worried about the ongoing military activity that was happening there. So you had Britain, America had a massive expedition called Operation High Jump in 1946, 1947, led by Rear Admiral Admiral Richard Byrd. They had over 4,200 men. They had 13 Navy ships. They had 25 aircraft, all going to Antarctica to set up Little America in the Ross Sea. So there were concerns that Antarctica might end up being like a military test ground, and there might be military conflicts happening on this very remote southern continent. So the diplomats got together, and under the leadership of the United States, they set up a whole series of top secrets negotiations in Washington, D.C. in the United States. And that all happened through 1958, 1959. And then the final results of that was the Antarctic Treaty. And that was signed by the 12 nations who are part of the IGY. And they signed that on the 1st of December, 1959. So the treaty was put in place, and it basically designates this whole continent, not just a part of it, but the whole continent is designated as a continent for science and peace. But in those days, in the early 1960s, they were very worried about military testing, nuclear weapons, military warfare happening in Antarctica. And no one really thought about protecting the environment, protecting the animals, the plants, the fish, the seals that live there. That's only been in the last 30, 40 years that environmental issues have come to the fore in Antarctica. And certainly that's how most people think of Antarctica now, as this amazing wilderness with this incredible wildlife. So since 1961, other agreements have come in place to bolster the original treaty. So you have an agreement to protect the marine environment and to regulate fisheries and fishing operations. That's called CAMLAR. It's a bit of a mouthful. That stands for the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. That came into force in 1982. And then there's more recently an agreement to further protect the continent from human impact and protect the environment. That's called the Environmental Protocol to the Antarctic Treaty, and that came into force in 1998. And as a very young scientist at British Antarctic Survey, I was very lucky to be involved in those original protocol discussions, which really, it was a bit of a life-turning moment for me to be involved in those such high-level discussions, and very unusual for a scientist to be involved in high-level diplomatic negotiations. So it's quite an amazing period in my life.
Well, it sounds like thanks to the passions of the scientific community largely, Antarctica is the way it is today because of this work in the Antarctic Treaty. It sounds like it could have been a very different place if people hadn't spoken up.
Yeah, you're quite right. And and this is where science and the evidence that scientists can provide really helps to change things in our world. So what does the treaty say? So first of all, because of this concern about what was going on in terms of nuclear weapons testing, military activities, Antarctica can only be used for peaceful purposes only. So military activities are banned, but the military can support what the scientists are doing. So that's perfectly okay to do. So nuclear explosions, disposal of nuclear waste, they're all banned. The territorial claims to Antarctica, so Britain, New Zealand, Australia, France all have territorial claims, but they're all frozen. They're all put to one side, and the treaty regulates everything that goes on the continent. Very importantly, all scientific information and data has got to be shared. So there's huge exchange programs between the different national Antarctic programs to ensure that they maximize the benefit of the science that's collected there, because it's so expensive. It's one of the remotest places on the planet. So it's hugely expensive to collect the data in the first place. So you've got to make sure it's properly curated and you share it to make sure you get the maximum benefit. Science stations, vessels, any activity in Antarctica can be inspected at any time. And we'll talk a little bit about that because I've got experience as an Antarctic Treaty Inspector. And then each year, the treaty nations all meet. They have a big international meeting. This year it's in Kochi in India. And they talk together for about 10 days or so about how best to manage the continent. And all decisions are made by consensus. So that means that everyone has to agree. So I can imagine in your class, for example, it's quite often probably very difficult to get everyone to agree to do something. But it is very powerful, because when everyone agrees, then you know that everyone's on board, we're all going to go forward to do this particular thing. And that's the power of the treaty. It might take a long time to get there, but when you're finally there, everyone's on board, everyone agrees, and you've got a very, very strong agreement. So who can sign the treaty? So any country in the world can sign the treaty. But if you want to have a voting to be able to influence the decisions that are made at the Antarctic Treaty and be present and be involved in all the discussions, then you've got to have two things. One, you've got to make sure you implement the treaty and the protocol and CAMLR in your own national legislation. And you also need to have a strong program of scientific research. In the past, that used to mean that you have to have a scientific research station in Antarctica. Not so much these days because of the power of satellite communications and the internet. But you need to have a good program of scientific research. And the people who coordinate all that scientific research is the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research. So they started before the treaty. They helped, they came out to the International Geophysical Year as well. Very important body for coordinating all of this science that happens in Antarctica. And they're based here in Cambridge. They had their headquarters at the Scott Polar Research Institute in England. So there's always been this very strong emphasis on international cooperation. And throughout my career at British Antarctic Survey, and then more recently working the Endurance22 Expedition, we always work internationally. So Tim, remember that on Endurance22, we had people from 10 different countries all working together with the one goal of finding endurance, but at the same time, collecting science data, because it's such a remote place that we were going to. Very few people ever get there. So to collect these measurements, particularly things such as sea ice, gives us a uniquely important data set from the expedition.
I think it's really interesting that the most recent signatory is Costa Rica.
That's right.
It's just a sign that what happens in Antarctica affects everybody.
You're quite right there. So Costa Rica signed up in 2022, and it'll be very interesting to see whether they will develop their own science program and perhaps work with other nations such as America or the UK. Be interesting to see how it goes with Costa Rica. So, I was very lucky to be a treaty inspector. In fact, I was a treaty inspector 3 times, but I'm just going to talk about 2 of these. First of all, I went to the Ross Sea in 2005 and did a joint treaty inspection with the US National Science Foundation, the New Zealand Antarctic Programme, which is called Antarctica New Zealand, and I was representing the United Kingdom through British Antarctic Survey. And here we are, we're in a place called the Dry Valleys, an incredible place. One of my most special memories is going into the Dry Valleys. And the 3 people there, so as you look at the screen, Dave Brisnahan, he was the base commander at the US base at McMurdo on Ross Island. In the middle there in the blue, that's Neil Gilbert, who is the Antarctic Environmental Officer for Antarctica New Zealand. And there's me on the far right, representing the UK and British Antarctic Survey. So, and one of my abiding memories is going into this amazing place called Taylor Valley. So we were looking at all sorts of protected areas, research facilities throughout the Ross Sea region and Ross Island. So but there are no roads. The only way you can get into the Dry Valleys is by helicopter. So we visited the Taylor Valley. The Dry Valleys are an incredible thing. They were discovered by Captain Scott in 1903. Scientists in New Zealand and in America have done a lot of work there, saying, well, how long have they been dry for? And as I understand it from the scientists, this area has been completely dry and extreme cold desert for something like 14 million years. It is quite amazing. And because it's been left in this way, you don't get ice and snow here because it's very low humidity, and also the glaciers. There are mountains around the Dry Valleys, and they act as dams and stop the glaciers from flowing in. So it is quite incredible. Very, almost nothing lives there. There is bacteria. They found bacteria living in rocks in the Dry Valleys. It really is a fantastic place. And you can see I've labelled on the slide there ventifacts. So these are very unusual rock features. So they're sculpted by the wind. You have incessant winds in the dry valleys. And so any gravel or bits of sand will actually erode the rocks into these incredible sculptures called ventifex. And that will take thousands of years. And you see these amazingly sculpted rocks there. But this area is it's very pristine, and it can be very easily damaged. The picture on the right, you can see there, is you can just make out there's like a little footpath. Now, that's because visitors are normally banned from the dry valleys because of the impact that they can cause. But there's one area where visitors can land in Taylor Valley. So helicopters can land there. Some tourists actually go and visit it. And they, over the last 20 years or so, they've created this little footpath. So you don't want a wider environmental impact. So whilst we were there, we were looking to see how that impact could be reduced and managed. And we recommended some site guidelines should be put into place, and that was done so by the New Zealand and American authorities. Next one, so we went into, this is Captain Scott's hut. It's called the Terra Nova hut. It's built in 1903 at the start of Scott's Terra Nova expedition, where he got to the pole, but tragically he and the polar party all died on the way back. So that hut still stands over 100 years old. So Neil and I here, you can see the photo of us. We're inspecting the site, and a particular issue at that time when we went in was the amount of snow. They'd had very, very heavy snowfall for several years, and there was a real issue of the snow accumulating against the walls of the hut and then melting, and the meltwater going underneath the hut and then refreezing and forcing up the floorboards. So we gave some recommendations, particularly on snow management, which were then implemented, and the area is being completely conserved and repaired and restored. It looks absolutely wonderful today. So yes, so there you see the significant build-up around the hut, and you go inside the hut, and many of the things which Scott brought in 1903 are still there in absolutely pristine condition. It's like a freezer inside, you see. So you've still got skis, the original skis that they brought. You can still see food, tomato ketchup, Heinz ketchup. I'm sure that's familiar to many of the students who are watching today. So all these things that we still see today in our kitchens or in our dining rooms are in that hut from over 100 years ago.
I think many of us have a bottle of ketchup in our refrigerator that's been there for quite a long time, but I don't know if any of us have a bottle of ketchup that's been there as long as the ketchup in the Cape Evans.
And and then more recently, I worked with the Royal Navy. I said earlier that the military can help support scientific activities, and they can also support Antarctic Treaty inspections. So in 2015, I was very lucky to work with the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, and we sailed on the ship. You can see the ship in the background. That's the British Royal Navy's ice patrol ship, HMS Protector. And we sailed down the Antarctic Peninsula this time, and we inspected about a dozen scientific bases, yachts, cruise ships. And perhaps one of my favorite memories is going into a Ukrainian scientific station called Vernadsky. And Vernadsky used to be a British station called Faraday. So there's a sort of tradition in Antarctica of sharing resources. So when British Antarctic Survey decided that they would the science that they wanted to change, they no longer wanted to work Faraday. They decided to give it to Ukraine. So it was given to Ukraine for £1, £1 English pound. And I was surprised that when I did the inspection, we went into the bar on board on the station, and there in the bar is the £1 that Ukraine paid. The then director of the British Antarctic Survey gave the pound back. So they got the base for free.
Yeah, what a deal. About $1 for an Antarctic research base.
But and Ukraine still run, they've still run the programs which BAS started there, including monitoring ozone. There's an ozone spectrophotometer up in the attic at Vernadsky. They still run that, but they do a whole range of other programs now, particularly in biology. And it's interesting that, when I went back, it was very different to when I was there, when I was a young scientist, first visited Faraday in 1991. Going back in 2015, the whole station had started to be colonized by Gen 2 penguins. And this is all because of climate change. Gen 2 penguins normally don't like living in ice, and they live further north in Antarctica. But with the sea ice reducing in Antarctica, they're moving further south and colonizing new sites. And so there's now quite a big Gen 2 penguin colony at Weddell, several hundred pairs now. I saw them a few weeks ago when I was last down in Antarctica. And they just didn't exist. They weren't there at all when I was there in 1991. So some of these impacts of climate change, they're not theoretical. They're actually happening right now in our own lifetimes.
All right. Well, before we switch over to the protection of endurance within the Antarctic Treaty realm, can you tell us really quickly, when you went as an inspector, what were you looking for?
So as an inspector, you're primarily checking to see that the station is abiding by the Antarctic Treaty. So, for a start, have they got any weapons? I'm pleased to say none of the stations that we went on had any weapons. How are they protecting the environment? What sorts of waste management procedures have they got in place? Are they making sure that fuel storage isn't causing oil spills? What sort of science are they doing? Are they actually doing science which has been endorsed through the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research? Also looking at things like safety, for example. Is it a safe place to work? On this inspection, actually, we visited a Brazilian station in the northern part of the peninsula called Shears, and Shears had a terrible fire a couple of years previously. So, you need to, and fire is one of the biggest dangers that you can have on an Antarctic base. Of course, there's no fire service in Antarctica. So there's no hospital service, no emergency rescue service. You have to do all of these things yourselves. So safety becomes a big concern. And so we're acting as an inspector, as like an independent check that these things are being done properly. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the Antarctic Treaty, a little bit about my experiences as a treaty inspector, and now we're going to talk a little bit about how the Endurance, the ship that the Endurance22 Expedition found, and lots of you watched live as we found the ship deep in the bottom of the Weddell Sea. So even before we found the ship, interestingly, that there were proposals getting started, including the first expedition I led, the Weddell Sea expedition, to go and search for the wreck. So the UK government decided back in 2019 that the wreck needed protection, even though at that time nobody knew where it was. So it was designated a historic site and monument. Very unusual to designate a historic site and monument when you're not entirely sure where it is. But the treaty allowed the UK government to do that. And as a result, when we went in to look for the wreck in 2022, we had a very, very strict permit from the UK government. So we weren't allowed to touch the wreck in any way, and even any of the debris surrounding the wreck, we're not allowed to remove anything from the site. But we were allowed to photograph it, to film it, and to scan it. And you can see the results of this non-disturbance survey in front of your eyes there, where these absolutely stunning images of the wreck on the seafloor. So the image you can see there, that's the stern, that's the back of the ship, where you can see Endurance there in brass, and the star, the Polaris star, the North Star, because that was the name of the ship before Shackleton bought it. It was called Polaris. So it's in absolutely beautiful condition. So it was first protected in 2019. And then the UK, once we discovered it, the UK, an organisation called the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust has been working on developing a conservation management plan. I'm part of their, if you like, stakeholder group, their group of experts who's been helping them write the plan. So the draft plan has been completed. It's gone out to international consultation, and now it's ready for the first time to go to all the senior diplomats, senior figures in the world of Antarctica, who will all be in Kochi in India at the end of this month for the 46th Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. So this will be the first time the plan will be presented to a big international audience. And from the feedback that we've provided to the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, we've asked for the area of seabed around the wreck to be extended. And there's a circle with a radius of 500 metres around the wreck. Currently, we've asked for that to be extended to 1,500 metre radius to include all of the debris field. There's material which came off the wreck as it was falling through the water column and hit the seafloor. So we need to ensure that all of that debris is properly conserved and protected. And what the UK government is also promoting is the idea that the wreck site also gets even greater protection through through designating an Antarctic specially protected area. And the other historic huts like Cape Evans that I showed, but also Shackleton's hut, Cape Broyds, the Discovery Hut, another one of Scott's huts, they're all Antarctic specially protected areas. So that's the highest level of protection you could give anything in Antarctica if it was to be an ASPA. So yeah, exciting discussions are going to be happening in the next few weeks, and I shall be very interested to hear what the results of those are going to be. So what about the future for the treaty? So I've described how activities there are really very carefully controlled and regulated through this amazing agreement, through the Antarctic Treaty, but it is under pressure. Activities are increasing, such as fishing and tourism, but also you've got impacts coming and affecting Antarctica from other parts of the world. So climate change, we talked a little bit about that, but also pollution. When we were in the Weddell Sea, on the first expedition, we had some scientists who are collecting sea ice, and they dissolved the sea ice, and they found that in those samples of sea ice, there were fibers, plastic fibers, and they didn't come from our ship or any other ships. You know, we know that those fibers would have come maybe in the air and been deposited from air currents, or they could have come on ocean currents, but they certainly weren't generated in Antarctica. And so it's very important that to protect Antarctica, that we also agree and implement international treaties. So there's one on climate change, which has already been agreed, but some of your students might know there's a big international treaty now being discussed called the Global Plastics Treaty. And in fact, my daughter, Isabel, has been working on that as part of the UK delegation, trying to reduce the amount of plastics going into the world's oceans. And if we can do that, not only will Antarctica be protected, but oceans around the world. So, just to summarise then, so the treaty has ensured peaceful international cooperation and scientific research in Antarctica for over 50 years. It's quite a unique governance system. There's nothing quite like the Antarctic Treaty anywhere else in the world. A whole continent preserved as a natural reserve devoted for peace and science. And from my own personal interests, having led the Endurance22 expedition, it's very satisfying to know that the wreck of Endurance has been given this very strong international protection by the Antarctic Treaty Nations. And I think the students and others listening to this should be aware that really the Endurance is probably the most protected shipwreck anywhere in the world because of the Antarctic Treaty. So she will remain on the seabed and preserved and conserved for future generations for, well, I hope for over another 100 years.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shears. I feel like we should call you Professor Shears because of all we learn from you every time we talk to you. Thank you so much. I have a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions in the chat, and I know we've got some students from Sunset Park who are ready to ask a couple questions too. So let's switch over to questions, and our group from PS1 has been waiting so patiently. I want to bring them on and say hello.
Say hello.
Hello.
Hi, PS1.
Is there somebody at PS1 who's very brave and would like to step up to the camera and ask Dr. Shears their question about the Antarctic Treaty or protecting Endurance or one of those topics? If you are, come on up and go ahead.
What is the one thing that you do on the ship or the plane as you're exploring?
What is the one thing that I do? So when I'm on my expeditions, I'm the expedition leader. So I'm looking after everyone on the ship. So Tim will tell you because he was on the ship with me. So the most important thing for me is safety. We're in a very, very remote place. So I don't want people getting injured in any way. Because it's a long way to get them back home to a hospital. So yeah, top thing for me is safety, always.
Okay, thank you.
All right, should we take one more question? I see a hand up in the back. Come on up.
Gabriel?
Or you can just speak really loudly, whichever you prefer.
How did you feel when you didn't find the ship the first time?
All right, okay. So this is a question about how did I feel when I didn't find Endurance the first time? Extremely sad. Extremely sad. So when I was told, so we had a subsea manager on the Weddell Sea expedition, a fantastic French lady called Claire Samuel, and I was eating. I was in the dining room on board the Endurance 2 when she came and told me the bad news that we'd lost our marine robot, this autonomous underwater vehicle. And I actually felt physically sick. I couldn't eat my meal. That's how bad it all was. So yes, I felt very, very, very sad indeed. I got to say, I could have cried at that moment, but that's not a good thing for an expedition leader to do. So I didn't cry, but just knew that we had to get on. We had to try and find that vehicle because we only had a couple of days before the weather would turn, and it would be going down to like -18, -20 degrees. The sea would freeze, and we might even get the Endurance 2, our mothership, sunk, trapped in the ice. So we only had a certain limited time. So yeah, I was very, very sad indeed.
Good, great question. PS1, I'll bring you back in just a second for more questions. Dr. Shears extending some greetings from the chat from Brazil, New York City, Warwickshire in the UK, Texas, and I think I said Washington, D.C. as well. So lots of people joining in from all over the world today.
Hi, everyone.
One of the questions in the chat is sort of what additional protections are afforded Endurance by being designated ASPA, specially protected area. You said that there were increasing protections, sort of the highest level of protection within the Antarctic Treaty. Can you just sort of tell us real quickly what additional protections does that afford Endurance?
Well, one, for an Antarctic specially protected area, it's even more rigorous permitting system to get onto the site. So normally for an ASPA, for a visit, it's strictly regulated, really only for scientific purposes for the most part. That would be one thing. The other issue, another way that you could protect the wreck would be to, as well as protecting the seabed, you could actually protect the water column around the wreck. So if you perhaps not now, but in the future, if fishing were to take place in that part of the Weddell Sea, it doesn't take place in the Weddell Sea at the moment, but there is krill fishing to the north of the area. If sea ice continues to reduce in the way that it has, primarily because of climate change and global temperatures rising, then in another maybe 20, 30, 50 years' time, then you could get fishing in the area, and you certainly wouldn't want, say, fishing nets getting entangled in the Endurance. So it would give, you could protect parts of the water column around the wreck. That would be another area that you could ensure was protected under an Antarctic specially protected area.
All right, great. You got into this a little bit, but all of us remember that Endurance is 2 miles underneath the surface of the Weddell Sea.
Mhm.
It's covered by constant ice, at least now. What are we worried about? What are we protecting Endurance against?
Well, I think that's exactly it, Tim. It's for the future. Is that at the moment, the wreck is in a very remote location. You've got a sea ice coverage on top of it. It's very deep, over 10,000 feet. So where she sits at the moment, the environment is protecting her. But as I explained in the presentation, the environment is changing, and it's changing very rapidly. I have been really surprised in the significant reduction in sea ice since I was first there in 2019. And you look at the satellite measurements now, we've had record lows in sea ice, not just in the Weddell Sea, but around Antarctica for the last 3 years. And there's no sign of the sea ice actually gaining again. So some of the scientists are now really worried that you're into a regime shift, and you're seeing reductions in sea ice that have taken place up in the Arctic. Well, could this be something which we're now going to see as a routine in Antarctica? And if the sea ice disappears, then it does mean that vessels, you don't need a big icebreaker like the Agulhas 2. Other vessels could come in much more easily and be able to get onto the wreck site. So at the moment, it's really fully protected. But what about another 20, 30 years' time? So you're planning now for what might be happening later on.
All right. Thank you very much. I have some questions that were submitted by students, and one of them, Jaden, are you with us today at PS1?
Is he here today?
No, Jaden submitted a great question for Dr. Shears. I want to ask on his behalf, especially related to your time as an inspector for the Antarctic Treaty, Dr. Shears. Jaden wanted to know, what's the best thing or the thing you've been most surprised by during your, 23 visits to Antarctica at this point? Something along that time? And what is sort of the worst thing that you observed or have witnessed during your many
Okay, so the most surprising thing, I think that was when I was at Stonington Island, which is at the far south of the Antarctic Peninsula. There's an old American base there called East Base, and there's a tank. I never expected to find a tank in Antarctica. So it was taken there in the early 1940s by an American expedition. So there's a tank. So I didn't expect to find that in Antarctica. And the worst thing I've ever found in Antarctica. One of the things that I've found very distressing whilst I've been in Antarctica, and I've seen it on treaty inspections, but also when I was working with the British Antarctic Survey, was entanglement of seals and birds in marine pollution. So I spent a lot of time working at a place called Signy Island in the South Orkney Islands, and there are many, many fur seals live on Signy Island. And you would sometimes find fur seals, they're very inquisitive creatures, and they'll play around with things in the water. And if there's like a packing band off a box or a crate, they'll play around with that, and it ends, and particularly when they're small pups, and it can get wrapped around their necks, and then they grow, and they can be slowly strangled by these straps. So on the British Antarctic Survey stations, there was, if a seal was ever seen that was entangled, then the guys on station, including myself, you would make a big effort to try and get that strap off the seal. But often the seal wouldn't know that you were trying to help it. And fur seals can be pretty aggressive. So you had to have about a team of 5 or 6 of you to pin the seal down once you got the strap off it, and then you could release it and put it back into the wild. So, but I think that's probably one of the most distressing things I've ever seen. So that's why it becomes very important to try and reduce pollution, because these packing bands coming off fishing vessels, but often they're sort of drifting in from South America. So if you're going to prevent marine pollution, it's got to be an international solution, not just one for the Antarctic Treaty nations.
Absolutely. Great. We've got PS1 with us still. If there's any students who have a burning question for Dr. Shears that you want to ask yourself, come on up. I see a hand. I see 2 hands. I see 3 hands. Great. Let's get through all of your questions for Dr. Shears.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Charlie, and I have a question to ask.
Go ahead, Charlie.
So, John Shears, what got you into science?
Okay, that's a good question. John Shears, what got you into science? Well, at school, I loved geography, the study of landscapes, the environment. That's what I really loved at school. But one of my teachers in my school had what was called a careers advisor teacher, and he said that I would never get a job in geography. That it was impossible to get a job. But I ignored that advice, and I went to university and did a degree in geography, and then did some further studies in environmental science and oil pollution, and that's what got me into science, was through studying geography and really being interested in the outdoor world, landscapes, wildlife. That's what got me into science.
All right, great question, Charlie. Thank you. Let's do a sort of rapid fire questions. Get as many in as we can. Do we have another student at PS1 who wants to ask a question? Yeah. While you're sort of thinking about it, I see a hand in the back. Come on up.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Give us.
Sure.
Hello, my name is Angel.
This is Angel from SC4.
Hi, Angel.
My question is, I'm wondering why you choose to be an explorer.
Why did you choose to be an explorer? He wants to know.
Okay. Why did I choose to be an explorer? Well, I didn't really choose to be an explorer. I finished my research studies at the university, and I saw a job advert for British Antarctic Survey, and just thought that was, and they wanted someone to work on the environment. So I wasn't employed to be an explorer. I was employed to be an environmental scientist, to study the environment and protect Antarctica from human impact and minimize the impact of the operations of the scientists and the logistics of British Antarctic Survey. That's how I got into it. And then as I developed my career at BAS, I got more interested in the logistics and operations, and then ran the stations and ships and aircraft which British Antarctic Survey operated. And that then made me have sufficient experience to become an expedition leader. And I suppose it's really only now that people would consider me to be an explorer. But when I joined BAS, I never thought of myself as an explorer at all. I thought of myself as a scientist.
Wonderful question. Let's get a couple questions from the chat. Oop, I moved John backstage. Let's get a couple of questions from the chat, John. We'll do a quick fire round of questions about endurance. Is the working paper with the management plan, will it be available for others to read? People who are interested in the process of, obtaining further protections for a site in Antarctica?
Okay, yeah. So normally what happens about 2 or 3 weeks, a month after the treaty meeting, all the papers are made accessible through the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat. So there's a secretariat to the treaty which helps run these big international meetings. If you go onto the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat website, they've got a fantastic searchable database. So for anybody who wants to look at the working paper, the conservation management plan, that will all be up about a month after the meeting happens. And I know from my contacts at the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, and a big shout out to them because they're the people who've produced the plan. I've helped them, but they're the people who've done all the hard work writing and putting the plan together. So Ruth Mollett at the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust and Heather Mary Mary, who's an archaeologist at Heritage England. They're the people who should get all the plaudits for writing the plan. That plan will also be going up on the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust website, probably in a couple of months' time. I think once they've had a chance to digest any of the views of the Antarctic Treaty nations, and perhaps they might need to update the plan before it goes public on the website. But certainly, I would have thought, June, July time, all the papers which were discussed at the treaty meeting, they'll be up and live on the Treaty Secretariat's website for anybody to see.
All right, great. I have to share at least one question from Barb in Texas. Barb, thank you for joining us. Lots of questions about, the data that was collected from our visit to Endurance. Are you aware of when the public will get their first chance to see some of those beautiful, images of the Endurance?
Okay. Well, I expect a lot of people listening in know that there's a National Geographic movie in the pipeline, and there's also a National Geographic book coming out about Endurance. So autumn for the movie, and our book, you can see it's already up on Amazon. That comes out on the 5th of November. So in the autumn, when the movie and the book come out, that'll be really the first opportunity that people will really get to see some of the absolutely stunning subsea imagery. It is incredible. I've been lucky to see some of the subsea imagery by working with Nico Vincent, the Deputy Expedition Leader and the Subsea Manager. And I can assure all the viewers that you won't be disappointed. It is incredible.
All right, fabulous. And for our US audience, I can confirm if you go to Amazon, you can pre-order your copy of Dr. Shears and Nico Vincent's book. I'm watching my mailbox and will be until it comes much sooner. We're sort of running low on time. I want to bring PS1 back. You have so many great questions. I have a whole list of questions I want to ask on your behalf, but I want to give you a chance. If any other student wants to step up to the camera and ask Dr. Shears their question, this will be your last chance to do so. So come on up and go ahead whenever you're ready.
Kevin, come up. Say hi to Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin, and I want to ask you a question. What inspired you to have this career?
What inspires you?
What inspired me to have this career? So, well, first of all, in terms of inspiration, it came from my family, particularly from my grandmother. My grandmother would take me and my two brothers out to our local museum and show us things there. So I think early inspiration came from my grandmother, but then at school I started doing expeditions and really got interested in geography and now what inspires me, well, Antarctica still inspires me.
John froze up. He froze up for a minute in the middle of a sentence. I think he'll be back.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I'm back now. So what inspires me now? I'm still inspired by Antarctica. I've been up to the Arctic and back to Antarctica since we discovered Endurance. I'm very, very much hoping that we might have an opportunity to go back to Endurance in a few years' time. We haven't surveyed all of the debris field around the wreck, so it'd be very cool to be able to get back there and finish off the job. Because when we found the ship, we only actually ever did 2 dives on her. So there's still information that needs to be collected, and there's some absolutely incredible science to be done. Lots of marine creatures living on the wreck. Many of those probably absolutely new species, new to science. So there's still a lot of excitement, passion, interest in going back. And I'd love to be able to do that in a few years' time. So I'm still inspired by Antarctica and by Endurance.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shears. We could talk to you for hours, and we'll surely have you back at some point to get through more of these questions about you. But it's been great to talk to you today. It's been great to learn more about the Antarctic Treaty. It's been great to learn more about this upcoming meeting of the Antarctic Treaty, where we're going to hopefully get further protections for the Endurance wreck site. And for our friends at PS1 in Brooklyn, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you here. You have a great day. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I'm going to move you backstage just as we sort of wrap up here. It's our YouTube audience, fabulous questions today. We got to as many as we could in the time we had. There is still so much to explore around the Endurance22 expedition, and of course, the future of Endurance, as some great people like Dr. Shears are working to protect the wreck site and learn everything we can about it. So make sure you check out Reach the World's on-demand virtual exchange materials. There are some wonderful educational materials available from our friends at the Royal Geographical Society. Don't miss those. And as always, thank you all for exploring with Reach the World today. We will see you again next time. Thanks a lot.
Bye.